Hey guys, Speculative Sandbox now has a shop. Treat yourself with graphic tees, tanks, stickers, and notebooks. Check out the podcast notes for a link, and don't forget to use the promo code SANDBOX to get 20% off.
If we take a look back just a few hundred years in our real-world history at maps, there are large portions of unexplored space. This shows up in one of two ways. Either you literally just have, here be dragons, just an empty blank wall, or you have a contraction, an artificial contraction of space, which, removes all of North America from the map because they didn't know it existed. There are cues to how the culture sees things.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Have you ever opened up a book and found a beautiful illustrated map inside the cover? Bonus points if it's in color and in rich detail. Sometimes it's reason alone to buy the book. If you love maps, then you're in the right place. Writer and founder of the Round Table Writers, Odin Halvorson, joins me to talk about maps in speculative fiction. From hyper-realistic to the fantastical, how do maps contribute to your overall story? And what are some important things to consider when creating one? So Odin, tell me about yourself and particularly about today's topic, which is about maps. You said you went to school about this topic. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I went to school for a master's in fine arts and creative writing through the University of Southern Maine's Stone Coast program, which is a really cool program, very original, very eclectic, and it's one of the few programs in the country, actually in the world, that deals with speculative fiction and deals with it in a way that's very positive.
Cool. I love that. So like
Yeah.
a whole area of study where you just talk about speculative fiction and in your case, particularly maps and how maps are created for stories.
That became my thesis. That became my my part of my final project. So I was writing a fantasy novel. And alongside that, I was doing this very close inspection of how geography was treated within Tolkien's kind of larger legendarium, his whole work, and why that type of geography can be so important for writers of any genre, not just fantasy and science fiction, but any genre to pay attention to. I mean, how many times have we read a book set in New York and you're like, okay, you've never been to New York. I haven't been to New York, and I know that you've never been to New York. That's
such a good point. I read a young adult series that took place in my town in Arizona, and they specifically talk about a road where a car gets trapped on the railroad tracks, except if you lived here, you'd know that was the one road that does not actually cross the railroad tracks. And it drove me crazy.
Oh, like the one road, guys, come on.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what got you interested? So when you were told you have to do this project and you're like, all right, maps is where it's at. What fueled that passion?
Well, luckily I was able to go ahead and really choose to follow my passion. So, I was able to go to my my thesis advisor and say, hey, I have this interest in maps. Can I do something with it? And she said, this is so cool. I can't wait to hear about it. But where that started for me as like a original concept really has to do with my overarching love of science fiction and fantasy, and the way that maps specifically were treated within science fiction. So actually my love of maps in fantasy came from the fact that there weren't that many maps explored in science fiction, or when they were often explored in this very loose way where think it was J. Michael Straczynski's point that when he was asked how fast one of his starships went, the White Star starship in his Babylon 5 TV series, he said it moves at the speed of plot.
Nice.
Because
Convenient, works well.
it's very useful, and I think that for his world, he took so much care in making sure that time was paid attention to and
Mm.
travel and distance, that that's okay. If every once in a while there's a bit of a, deus ex machina and things appear when they need to appear, that's fine. But then there are so many instances where maps in science fiction, because we're dealing with such huge areas, huge space, and the time distance, they just get ignored.
It's such a good point because I brought two examples of maps for our conversation, and neither of them are sci-fi. And I'm realizing that sci-fi actually is a great opportunity for maps. The ones that I really like tend to be kind of futuristic or like cyberpunk versions of cities. And
Mhm.
why not create a map of a city with its cyberpunk attributes? Like it lends itself very nicely to a map.
Absolutely. I think, dealing with any type of landscape, once again, whether we're dealing with a real world location where the details really lend the credence to the story, right? They help inform the reader, they connect the reader to a physical space, and they give the reader that sense that this is a real location with real time inherent in the location. But when you do that in fantasy or science fiction, it's even more important because we're already dealing with a constructed landscape.
That's such a good point because it's a fictional world and you're inviting someone into it on the fantasy level. But could
Mhm.
you open up a book, look at a map, and in a few seconds go, "This is a good story"? Can you tell?
That's an interesting question, actually. I think you can, in a certain sense, based upon based upon some other subtle cues. So in Larry Niven's Ringworld book, for instance, you're dealing with a this was back in like 1970s. Don't quote me on the exact date, but when he was writing this, and whatever flaws the rest of his books have with regards to many issues, one interesting point was how the landscape was specifically described solely through the character's experience of the landscape. So just within the text, there's no map. The only reference that readers get beyond that map to the fact that there's something really awesome happening in the landscape is the cover art that shows this fascinating kind of curve, a hyperbolic curve up into the horizon. And of course, that is the ring world, a world that is artificially built around a star. So you don't need a map for that. You just need to experience that viscerally from within the character's perspectives. I will say that there are times where maps can also be overused and can stand in for for less than adequate writing in
Uh-huh.
terms of geography, and that is a very dangerous zone that a lot of writers can trip into.
Yeah. Yes, I have made kind of a casual observation of that too. When I open up a book and so much work got put into like the illustrations and it's gorgeous, and then I look
Mhm.
at like maybe how did the book do, how is it doing in reviews, you know what I mean, and maybe it's
Yes.
a bit of a hot mess, and but at least you've got a gorgeous map. When you look at a map, what's like the first thing you look for?
Hmm. I'd say there's two aspects to it. One, I look for just kind of the depth of a map. That's really the most important thing to me overall, because the depth of the map informs to a certain extent the depth at which the world is going to be constructed. Now, not always. I am making a generalization here for all the listeners who just threw their computer across the room. I am making a generalization, but I think it's important to pay attention to how a map is constructed with regards to depth. And what I mean by that is if we take a look at, for instance, Tolkien maps, especially maps of the Shire, we see signs, we see references, symbolic references within the map to a depth of time, and within that depth of time, a depth of culture. So we know, for instance, that the Old Forest, it's old from the relative perspective of the hobbits who were making the map. We understand that there's the hedge, all in capitals, all bordering that old forest. We understand that these things are references that are important to that culture. And from just those two things, we understand that there's something dark and something kind of strange and otherly about this forest that is intentionally kept at bay by the hedge. And then from within that, we understand that here's this farthing, here's that farthing. Here are all of these locations that are mapped and known and clearly clarified for the people who made the maps within the world. Whereas in a lot of the less accurate mapping, we can end up just sort of seeing these broad strokes of things that are made because they look good, but they're not really dealing with that level of subtlety.
Okay.
How
So
do
it's
you pick that
almost like
apart? You know.
it's like if you were to create a map that reflected the society's current understanding of the geography, showing that there are things that have history, things that they may not know otherwise about, versus a map where everything's labeled and, like, am I kind of on the right track?
Very much. I mean, let's take a look, especially this is especially true for fantasy and science fiction, which so often deal with large areas of unexplored space, unexplored geography. So if we take a look back just a few hundred years in our real world history at maps, there are large portions of unexplored space. This shows up in one of two ways. Either you literally just have "here be dragons," just an empty blank wall, or you have a contraction, an artificial contraction of space, which removes all of North America from the map because they didn't know it existed. There are cues to how the culture sees things. A great example is actually in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy,
Okay.
where you can see the kind of through these different books, you see a different layering of the importance of geography for the people on Mars, where the first time it's all landscape, it's all the actual mountains and the valleys, right? What is right there. The second book, we start to really see examples of the human impact, the cities, and those are made prominent. And then finally in the third one, we actually see the results of Mars terraforming, where new lakes have been created and new patches of green exist. So we're able to actually watch in development over the course of this long time span the development of the geography, and that's something that's really exciting.
So when you were doing your studies for your project, how much did you parallel or look at real maps?
Ooh, a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot. This is another interesting area. So I kind of hop skipped back from a lot of modern work on maps. So modern conceptions of maps, which I think because you said you worked in this kind of field, right? You've got a lot of detail, a ton of depth can actually appear within a map, which is really impressive on, a 2D scale, right? But with every single line, you've got the ability to have, elevation. You've got the ability to have so much depth within these maps. You don't often see that in fantasy maps. But what
Okay.
you do see are kind of what I was referencing before, the depth that comes from naming. So I actually went farther back and started to specifically look at how landscapes were portrayed within very, very early maps, including oral representations that were then written down. So specifically, the Icelandic sagas. And if we take a look at the sagas, the landscape is incredibly important as an organizing structure. It is something that gives both a cultural and a space-time reference for the people, both the characters in the sagas and the people who are going to be reading those sagas. So when we, as modern people, look back at the sagas, we can actually understand what the landscape looked and even felt like just by understanding that relationship, by kind of archaeologically digging away and figuring out what that relationship was. We can actually experience a little bit of what it was like to be someone in all of the eras that those stories were created.
Yeah, when you're looking at real world maps and comparing them to like fantasy or science or fictional maps, I should just
Mm-hmm.
generalize that. And in reference to what the point you brought up, yes. So I get a lot of exposure to maps. I also get a lot of bird's eye view of community building in my day job. And one of the things I always think about is, you can always tell when a map doesn't quite reflect the closest it can get to reality when things just feel kind of just placed,
Mm-hmm.
and for example, where I work, It's kind of a flat plain, but we're surrounded by mountains, and it was a hotbed for Native American communities way back in the
Mhm.
day because when it rained, it brought all the water rushed down to that area. What happened after the Native Americans were no longer populating this area and it became farmland because naturally
Mm.
all that same exact water comes down and feeds the farmland. And then when you talk about corridors that go through that land, now we're introducing some interesting challenges because of those very same conditions. So we have a freeway that comes through, and that section of the freeway gets flooded. No other
Yes.
area, you know what I mean? And so then when we start to build houses in that area, that same
Mhm.
exact water pattern creates a floodplain. And so now you have to create housing developments, commercial developments that cater to and create drainage. This is very simple, and I'm only talking about water, but it tells you how one geographical landmark can significantly alter the events of what happens in the area and continue to affect them as society evolves.
Absolutely. I love hearing you talk about this because you are clearly like an expert in this area, and there is actually something really exciting about understanding this. I think a lot of people, they hear maps and they go, "Oh yeah, that's nice. Why would I need that? I've got Google."
Yeah.
It's like you are missing the point, man.
Yes. Yeah. Could you
Yeah.
imagine if you're like, I just want to plop a house down right here and not really understand, all the things that
Yeah.
can affect you because of those conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being a kid. Oh God, I must have been about 11 or so. And my family was trying to find a new place to rent, and we actually got a weird lead on some place that we were thinking we might be able to buy, and it was up in northern California. So we went and visited it, and gosh, beautiful landscape, golden Rohan-esque hills. It's just the best that Northern California has to offer, except for two problems. One, every 5 years, there's a massive firestorm that sweeps those hills like nobody's business and turns it all to ash. So small issue.
Yeah.
Number two, the nearby lake was filled with mercury. So,
No.
yeah.
How?
So why was the land so cheap? From an old mine, from old mining
From old
practices.
mining.
Yeah. Which is a
Wow.
whole nother problem on, ecological issues described within geography. But
So if you were to create a fictional world and you happen to have a mining town nearby, then you got to start
Mm,
thinking about your water sources, the impacts to the
yep,
surrounding areas. And
yep.
right now, with like the drought in California, I saw footage of just ash falling from the sky, and that's something you guys deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fun. Have you ever wondered what it's like to live, on the edge zone of one of those, dark lord realms in fantasy? It's right here.
In Northern California.
Northern Cali. Come for the Dark Lord, everybody.
So I
Oh.
have a fun exercise, and this I figure we can go back. I only brought two maps, and you told me about one map. Do you have any more maps, or is that the one map
I
you mentioned?
have, I mean, I can talk about a few of the ones that I've collected for sure.
Okay,
So
awesome.
yeah, lead
Cool.
on.
So we are going to talk about some of our favorite maps. And while we're talking about them, we're going to think about some things like why do we love this map and how does this map functionally serve the characters and the story?
Hmm.
Because ultimately it all comes down to the narrative that you're writing, and everything kind of has to serve those characters.
Hmm.
So do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'd
Okay.
be happy to. Well, why don't I have two here that I want to talk about. So why don't I briefly just kind of go over what I love about Narnia and Oz as maps?
Okay. So for our listeners, if you want to pull it up on Google, I'll also try to post these maps on social media.
So for both Narnia and Oz, we are dealing less with direct, like geological, geographic importance, and we are more dealing with the realm of the imagination, the realm of ideas. But why are these maps even there? One of the really cool things about the C.S. Lewis map that he had for Narnia is actually that it shows that Narnia is just part of a much vaster landscape, a much vaster world. So we have, this very focused story. And a lot of people just think of Narnia when they think of Narnia, but they might not realize that there's a massive ocean that's traveled through, that right underneath Narnia there's Archenland. There are wild lands to the north. There are these stand in zones within his geography that have different feels to them, different, you could almost call them different kind of mythic archetypes laid onto the landscape itself. And Aslan actually only really exists as a character within Narnia, which is really important as a reference point for the stories that come later when the characters are traveling to other lands and they are told to specifically watch out for a character who knows who Aslan is, because that character is the character you need to trust, right? Because
Okay.
Aslan doesn't exist anywhere else outside of Narnia. So we actually see this interesting border, these interesting borders that are created within this very almost silly, very magical sort of otherworldly geography. So that's one of the maps that I want to talk about, simply because it's different than what a lot of people think of when they think of maps. I'm not talking here about all the depth that I was talking about in Tolkien's work or real world stuff. I'm talking purely about that realm of the imagination and how we can actually learn to divide that up to create story, which is really an exciting space for
Gotcha.
writers.
A really good introduction too for especially children who are getting into understanding maps.
So much.
I'm looking at a Narnia map right now. I see Archenland at the south.
Mm-hmm.
We have Lantern Waste up in the
Mm-hmm.
northwest. Uh Ettinsmore, did I say that right? Ettinsmore.
Ettinsmore, yeah.
Yep, up in the north. And then what looks like just brown, maybe this is what you were talking about, where it just kind of like fades away. What's to the east of Narnia?
Yeah, so if you're heading off towards the east, you are looking at the ocean. So
Okay.
you've got the Great Eastern Ocean
I
heading
see. That's an ocean.
off towards the right side of your map there.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And
So
that's where like the Voyage of the Dawn Trader and all of Treader and all of that takes place.
gotcha. So with Narnia, the general Narnia area, that's like in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But then in some of the other books, you start adventuring off into the other lands.
Absolutely. And actually in the very first book in the kind of the Narnia canon, you are here in the real world and you're actually in a sort of liminal zone in between worlds and a completely different fictional science fiction-esque world somewhere off in the galaxy. So there's actually a lot of depth that he plays with in terms of location within his geography. That distant science fiction-esque world is actually where the queen comes from. So
Mm.
you've got some really interesting stuff that he's playing with through his use of geography.
When you have a map and a world, a lot of what we're doing is world building.
Mhm.
When you are dealing with a very fantasy based map, like how do you know that it's grounded enough to work as a story? And how do you know when it's too fanciful, too out there to really be effective?
Mhm. That's a really good question. Too fanciful. That is probably a hard boundary to define, specifically because what you're trying to tell is the story in that case is going to start to matter the most. So for Lewis, he is working purely within this realm of mythic parable. And he's,
Okay.
he's pulling from every possible dimension, to the point where Tolkien was frankly getting annoyed with him. He was like, "Man, you can't have talking beavers and this. What is Jesus lion doing here?" He's getting very frustrated with his friend, and C.S. Lewis is like, "Hey, well, they're kids. Look, they don't care. Why should we?"
Good
And so
point.
especially when you're working, I think, with a realm like this, and I'm not just meaning that it's only important for children either. What I'm meaning is maps like this can help any reader access that sort of inner childlike experience of the world, where we stop caring so much about the specificity, and we're allowing ourselves as the reader to dive into the mythic, truly dive into a world of the unknown and the excitement of that. So what, for instance, if we're looking at this, what are the wild lands of the north right above the Ettenmoor in Narnia? Like, what does that mean? That evokes that name. So now
Mhm.
we're in the realm of naming and symbology again. What does that evoke for the reader? That's exciting, especially if you're 10 years old.
Well, and that gets me thinking about, I was thinking this about one of my examples, which is Westeros, but like how
Mm,
on the nose some of these names tend to be, because
absolutely.
you're introducing us who have no idea, we don't live here, and we have to be able to like jump in quickly. And there's a
Mhm.
lot of information that gets thrown at us at once. So what are your thoughts on like how on naming conventions?
Ooh, so this is once again back in like the area of all this that I really love, and it connects directly to the Icelandic maps that I was studying for my graduate thesis. A really good example, actually, of this, and I'm looking at my notes right now here, is from the first written account of the discovery of North America from that kind of Western perspective, where in the Deeds of the Bishops of Hamburg, which was written by Adam of Bremen, we see this naming become extraordinarily popular. Within this account, we're actually seeing a lot of attention paid not just to the geography, but to the names that were placed within that geography by the people who were, discovering it for their own first time. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about how landscape as an organizing structure is so important. These people were discovering areas that were new to them, and they were giving them names and stories. They were building a definition of the land as they went through the land, right?
Yeah.
So you have if we look at it to a lot of myths, we can see this happening in Ireland. We have myths about the great giant coming across the strait there, and all of those landscape names that we still have today are based on these stories that we told each other for hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. So that kind of naming is really exciting for me as a writer, as a fiction writer. How can I suggest 1,000 years of history, of storytelling history within my story without writing a single paragraph about it? Well, one way is to name correctly, and to have that name evoke something that we're going to be familiar with through that kind of cultural hereditary experience of naming things in this way.
Why not name everything after the founder? The first thing I would think is, if I'm Lewis and Clark and I'm going through America and I'm like, I'm gonna call this Lewis Forest, I'm gonna call this Clark River, and and not that that's not the best idea or the worst idea in the world, but I'm like, I'm surprised it doesn't happen more. Honestly, I think if Elon goes lands and takes up land on the moon, I wouldn't be surprised if it was something related to his name, or Tesla. You know what I mean? Like, I just like, what
Definitely.
prevents that?
Although, do we really want a section of Mars named Musk? Just
It's all in the branding.
I don't want to live there. Yes, this place, it's really musky. Yeah, it's not going to work for me. But it's a great question, and I think honestly that's a realm for some more thought. My immediate sort of response would be that we're storytelling creatures. So if we want to tell someone about the cool thing that we found, we're less likely to just say, I went to Halvorson Plateau and saw a bear. Done. Story over. We're going to talk about the bear. We're going to talk about the epic fight that we had from it when we really ran away. We're going to talk about something that excited us, and we're going to try to express the emotional experience of visiting that location to whoever's listening. It's that oral tradition. So I think, even if I said this place is now mine, unless I try to codify that within law, what's going to exist and live on within stories is the story. And maybe I'll survive in it if I was exceptionally cool.
Yeah.
But otherwise, probably not.
Well, and I could see how that would have more immortality to it versus, let's say I named a mountain Vicky Mountain, and then someone didn't like me, and they're like, I'm gonna conquer that mountain, and it's gonna now be Odin Mountain, and you know what I mean? Like, the names will keep changing if it's constantly associated with a person, because there's that pride. And but then if you do what you're saying, which is, let's call it Bear Valley, we got attacked by this bear, now that has like a legacy to it, and it might have way more legs.
Absolutely. Anything that evokes that kind of sense of wonder and that love of telling stories and that love of the unknown, that's the kind of name that's going to stick around. And it can be simple. Once again, I'll reference Tolkien's The Old Forest. We don't need to do much. The Hedge. These are not deep symbolic names, and yet they are. And that's what's so exciting and so cool. And of course, they also are in relationship to each other. So if I have Bear Valley right next to the wastes, that's going to evoke a very specific sort of experience. If I have Bear Valley next to, Paradise Falls, that's a different type of experience in there too.
Yeah.
So as we layer the naming, we start to evoke a deeper mythology. And I think that, a lot of ancient explorers, a lot of, not so ancient explorers too, would have been doing something sort of similar.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So my first map that I wanted to bring up is the one I'm sure is very familiar to everybody, and it's Westeros from Game of Thrones. However, I need to put a disclaimer at the beginning. I am a casual viewer. I read the books years ago. I enjoy the maps and the art. I'm watching The House of the Dragon right now. If I get anything wrong, forgive me. In fact, correct me. Just write me on social media. We'll have a continued conversation on there. So anyway, with that being said,
It's good to have a disclaimer.
so I'll give a quick description on Westeros for the audience that also hasn't seen the map. It's an elongated map. People have likened it to the UK. You kind of have like this tall up down kind of orientation. We're talking just Westeros. I'm not including, what's the other country called? See, I'm showing my ignorance already. I don't remember. So it's the map serves as a board for our characters to interact. So forests and roads become high or low traffic points, castles become targets, villagers and villages are pawns in a game of conquest. You can tell that whoever, George R.R. Martin, who wrote this map, wrote it with conflict in mind, because that's what's reflected in a lot of the names. So like many fantasy maps, I feel like the characteristics and attributes of each region in Westeros are a caricature when you look at how varied they are in close proximity to each other and how they're toned for the intention of the story. However, I live in America where you can drive for 5 hours staring at the same landscape. And I know that's not the case in the UK. So what do I really know? Okay, so I wanted to point out, and we can dedicate literally an entire podcast series to just this map alone. But for the sake of time in this conversation, I wanted to touch on a few notable locations based off of their geography and living conditions. And I had some questions for you. Okay.
Oh, yes.
So we'll start with King's Landing, which I think is like a very typical, like where you would see the main capital of a country. It's located on Blackwater Bay. It's a good location. It's a harbor town, goods and services coming in by the water. They're surrounded by walls. You can see how a harbor town got started and then built, bigger, bigger, bigger. And by now in the story of Game of Thrones, very populated, very dirty. And according to the author, he would say that it's equal to the size of medieval London or Paris, about 500,000 people. So King's Landing kind of makes me think of New York, like a harbor town, got started, built up. Do you think that that the book got it right as far as where King's Landing and where like the main capital would be located on that map?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I'm just kind of poking my nose into a copy of this map right now, and in a sense, if I'm looking at it right now, you've got some of the right geographical features. You've got sort of an inlet. So you've got a place that's going to be sheltered from storms. This is very important if you want a trading port. You don't want it to be on a blank rocky coast because then everybody's dead.
Yeah.
So, he did well there. I mean, if you take a look at the geography of his whole landscape there's a lot of variation. He's clearly thinking about how elevation, you can't really see elevation in his map, but you can see how elevation would work in relation to some of the rivers and where the mountain ranges generally are. And as for that location specifically, the biggest question is it the best place in proximity to power structures? I guess for his novel, that's really the most important thing. And it's an important thing for real world trade as well. What actually defines Westeros as a major trade hub? What makes it a trade hub? And what's allowed the power structure to inform, specifically that city, King's Landing, as the trade hub?
Yeah.
You know.
So then the next location, which is the Riverlands. The Riverlands is right in the middle. And as its name states, there's a lot of water there. They have forests, hills, plains. The land is rich and fertile. And the word river is associated with much of their social system. River lords, river men, riverlanders. What I found to be interesting is there are no major cities here. There's just small towns. And I thought for sure that with a fertile land like this, over the evolution of Westeros, a major settlement would have eventually laid claim to that spot. There's a lot of resources. So where I live in the desert, that's like literally where we would all be huddling, So do you think a land like the Riverlands would have been further developed in the real world?
That's in the real world. Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, we can see a lot of that happening in, for instance, rural China is a great place to look for kind of that a modern example of rural development. If you have a lot of money and a lot of power, and you have a lot of empty space that's really fertile, you're going to start building things there because it just makes sense. That's going to take time. So there's that. There's also the feudal nature of this society to take into account within the fantasy world that he created. The Riverlands seem like they are kind of caught constantly, just like all of the rural areas. I mean, it really sucks to be a villager in
It really
his.
does.
It's so
It's
bad.
like it becomes a really shitty place. Like I think in the second book or something, when it's all getting burned down, it's terrible.
I was really hoping that the books would kind of switch and change, and it would basically be this grand story of like communist rebellion, because that I didn't care about any of the royal characters after like the first quarter of the story, and I was just like, can we please stop having these poor defenseless villagers die?
I'm like, by the end of the story, there's no villagers left. Like,
No,
just literally rolling family.
You've just got a bunch of like somehow randomly self-sufficient armies marching around forever. It's very strange.
Oh my god, so true. God, they would have like ran out of food if they're burning down their Riverlands.
Yep, absolutely. You can't destroy the breadbasket. If you destroy the breadbasket, you starve. So, especially when you're on an island, it's not like they don't have very many friends in other parts of the world, especially because they keep killing the delegates from the other parts of the world. So, like, I mean, you are on an island. It's a big island, I get it, but still. Anyway.
That's so funny. Okay, well, I forgot. Were you in the middle of making a point, or
mild digression there?
Okay,
I had to release some anger on the.
I just didn't want to move on, and then your point didn't get made.
No. I think really just to kind of answer your question there, I think in the real world we would be seeing probably more development, but it also is a contextual thing. So if in the real world we have a breadbasket between 2 or 3 competing entities that are every couple hundred years socking the heck out of each other, the breadbasket is going to be a very tenuous place that nobody is going to want anyone else to have complete control over, because as soon as you do, you can supply your army better and then you're going to win. So it'll be actually a hot point where nothing permanent can get built for anyone.
Absolutely. Okay. Then I have two other areas I want to cover because they're just so interesting to me. The Iron Islands. They are a scattering of islands off the west coast of Westeros. They originally had their own king, eventually became a constituent region of the Seven Kingdoms. The land itself has a lot of iron ore. However, the residents living there say that the Iron Islands was named after their iron personalities. So they're rough, they're tough, and they're fierce seafarers. I hope I said that right. I don't live by the ocean. I don't know these words. Some islands are used for sheep grazing. Many are unpopulated, not very fertile lands. Oceans are violent. So this kind of feeds off of what you said earlier. What would you naturally expect from a civilization who grows up in these conditions? Is it sustainable? And would they have migrated by now to the Riverlands?
I mean, I think they'd certainly want to in a certain circumstance, but clearly what he's trying to build there is a cultural development that says, this is our space. We are the people of the Iron Islands. Rah, we're proud of ourselves. Does he do that well enough? Might be a kind of a way to deepen the question. And I'd really have to do a close inspection of the text to decide for myself. But I think it's fair, but it does feel sort of surfacey. It does feel sort of too intentional on the author's part, creating an area once again that is intentionally designed to have conflict built into it. So what is otherwise a really interesting location, geographically speaking, lots of cool little islands there, a potentially interesting culture. Are we actually getting the depth out of it, or are we just getting, these people need to fulfill this role in my story, so I'm going to call them this and name them this and give them this culture?
Good point. Good point. Because from my very rough memory of the books, it seems like the characters on the Iron Islands have a vendetta and they're angry and they kind of serve that kind of, opponent role. And I
Mhm.
just keep thinking, why are you still there? Like it seems really miserable.
I as a really brief digression, there's another example of this within the Killer Chronicles by Pat Rothfuss. I don't know if you've read those.
I've not, but I've heard of it.
They're fantastic books in many ways, and one of the things that I love about the second one the most is actually a culture that he creates that specifically moved to the most barren, rocky part of the world that it could, because everywhere else they were hounded, they were persecuted throughout this world, so they moved far away from the rest of the world intentionally. And
Mm.
what the question there then is, how do you survive there? Why do you stay there? Well, they were shepherds. Lots of grass, lots of rock. It worked fine for their sheep. What was the next thing that they did? They realized, okay, so we've been persecuted all of this time. We need to have an export that makes us invaluable and allows us to defend ourselves. So they took this martial arts tradition that they had and they built it up over time further and further and further until they became superlative mercenaries, and they hire themselves out to anyone who wants them. And the Adem, as they're called, then become a commodity in and of themselves. Their culture is the commodity. No one would ever invade them, A, because nobody wants their land. B, they are crazy warriors, so it would be really hard to take them over. And C, then you're losing your best export against your own enemies, the ability to hire Adem mercenaries. So Pat answered that question very well within the world as a deep element of the world, and I love it.
Okay, then I'm realizing I'm sure the Iron Islands are providing minerals maybe to armies, and then they are useful that way. I'm going completely off memory, and I'm also half making this up.
This is why, like, for these discussions, you start to have to close read every single text. So
and I know someone's like,
insane.
actually, I'm like, well, if you have a correction for me, send it to me. I will share it. All right. And then the last one was mostly because there's always a exotic part of a map where things are just not as Aryan as the rest. This is Dorne. So Dorne is the southernmost peninsula of Westeros, rocky, mountainous, dry, and hot, the only desert in the continent. I relate. A large portion is an arid wasteland, which I thought was interesting because then right away I'm like, how far away is Winterfell and the land of always winter from Dorne when you can go from this arid desert to this like forever winter? I wish it was that close. I guess you could go up a mountain and maybe get that. There are some rivers which help with fertility, and so therefore civilization is closer to the water. There is a cultural separation from the rest of Westeros. They're seen as exotic to the rest of the country with their food, produce, and customs. And according to Martin, it was inspired by Wales, Spain, and Palestine. So I guess my general question is, let's see, where is my general question? I had a general question, then it went away. Okay. What are your thoughts on situations like this where you have kind of like the exoticness kind of wrapped up in one little corner? My other map, Legend of Zelda, also does this, where there's like a random corner where it's like, this is all the other things that are very mysterious.
Yeah, there is a deeply problematic element to this that is incredibly complex because it's connected to how maps in the real world have been developed and how they are so frequently centered around basically the colonizing force. Whatever the most powerful colonizing force is, they are the ones who get to make the maps that are eventually going to get passed on. Why this has become a trend within fantasy maps where that same process doesn't have to take shape, that there are a couple of things. So one, you've got, I'd say, a case of really unfortunate Orientalism that is taking place within our culture. So you've got people who are not inspecting their own prejudices about how a world is constructed very clearly. To jump really quickly away from this to another landscape that I know really well, I'll actually take us over to Frank Herbert's Dune.
Okay.
And if we're taking a look at Arrakis, the world of Dune, where all the big action takes place, you're actually only looking at this little tiny, when you actually look at the map, you're only actually looking at this little tiny segment of kind of the North Pole. Everything beyond that is this kind of unknown blank canvas. We're talking about an entire planet here that's considered an unknown blank canvas. The little tiny area is the colonizer's map. It is
Ooh.
intention, and Herbert did this intentionally for all of his weirdness, being an NRA touting conservative. He was an ecologist first and foremost, and he did have this really potent way of exploring and explaining that colonizers kind of attitude and how limited it is when you're actually looking at the world.
Yeah.
Here on Westeros, I don't really see that same sort of inspection taking place. I do see maybe 4,000 miles, of kind of vertical territory here on the map that I'm looking at. So there is enough for it to pass through several really major, climate zones.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Wow. If he hadn't made the culture down there quite so generic, if he hadn't made all of his cultures quite so generically based on a real world culture in that kind of same geographic environment, I wouldn't have quite the same issue that I do. And once again, hey, people can correct me. I am not a Westeros expert. I am not an expert on his work, mainly because I don't like his work that much. Sorry, JR. But I do think that there's a lot of thought given to it, but I think that it can unfortunately tends to be a little too close to how the real world functions in a certain sense, and therefore you're not actually inspecting things, you're just making tropes of the characters who live there. So that's my short hot take.
Excellent point. Let's talk about your Oz.
Sure. So Oz is a great one, and this actually spirals off onto another map that I'd love to just briefly talk about as well.
And we're talking about the Marvelous Land of Oz and the Wizard of Oz?
The Marvelous Land of Oz and the Wizard of Oz is one of those great kind of maps that, once again, just like Lewis's, is a map that is completely based in the realm of the imagination of the story. So we're not looking at physical geography again.
Okay.
This is one of the ones that I wanted to highlight kind of earlier, though, in relationship to C.S. Lewis's. So we're kind of taking the discussion back a step there. We could look at this other map that I'm actually very excited to explore, which is the map from Werner Vinge's Zones of Thought novels.
Okay.
These guys, these different maps that he's created are really lovely and unique on two levels. One, they stylistically reference a lot of the fantasy maps that we're used to, and they do that through a very simple line portrayal. It's all ink and white paper, black ink, white paper portrayal of his galaxy, of an entire galaxy.
And this is the image that you had sent me, right?
Yeah,
I'm looking at that right now. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
And I'm only jumping to this because I think it both touches on some of what I'd say about Oz, and it jumps us into the realm of science fiction maps in particular, which just they don't get enough love.
No, I love this. I don't think I've ever seen a galaxy map before. And I'm like, why isn't this happening more? Maybe I'm reading the wrong books.
No, it's actually, so this is a great point. There's been a lot of thought about this from people who are interested in maps. I think his name was Jonathan Crow. He's a maps historian. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Crow is his last name. He's a maps historian, a scholar of fantasy fictional maps, and he made the point that maps in a fantasy story tell you what kind of story you're going to get. First off, you're going to get the kind of fantasy story that has a map. And then within that, you can pick out a lot more textual cues about what kind of story you're actually going to get. So you might have C.S. Lewis's really vague, broad dimensions of general area and very imaginative, or you might have Tolkien or Martin's kind of very specific, tied into the world, more detail oriented kind of thing. With science fiction, you don't really see that same sort of continuity. You don't see the same sort of maps drawn, specifically because we're dealing, at least this is my theory, specifically because you're dealing with such a huge amount of space. So, for instance, last night I watched the final episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, where season four, where uh, the Klingon Empire is having a civil war and they're being aided by the Romulans.
Yeah.
And Starfleet sends some ships into the Romulan border, Romulan Klingon border, to try to stop the Romulans from secretly getting supplies into the Klingon, the Klingon rebels' hands. Okay, fine. Woohoo. That's cool. Neat story. They do this by having a bunch of Federation starships strung out along the border with a net. Now, you can clearly see that whoever read this was a fan of World War II era kind of naval logistics, because two-dimensional nets don't work in three-dimensional space. So, this highlights the problem that I think anyone dealing with three-dimensional space has, is just conceptualizing it and then conceptualizing story onto it, right? So if our
Mm-hmm.
stories come from a tradition of landscape and a tradition of naming the places that we're moving through, how does that work when you're moving through literally light years of functionally empty space?
Interesting.
Right. So here, what Werner Vinge did is really awesome. He, in his books, Fire Upon the Deep and the others that followed, he has what he calls the zones of thought within a galaxy. The farther you go out from the kind of the dense center of the galaxy, the more advanced the potential technology can get. That is because within these different zones of thought, different natural laws of physics apply. It's fascinating. It's really exciting. He himself is a computer scientist and physicist, so there's a lot of really neat detail that gets put into all of this. And we, for instance, here on Earth would be within the slow zone. We can only travel at the speed of light. We've got
Uh-huh.
a lot of limitations. But you go up one level and you're dealing with artificial intelligences that are truly intelligent. You are dealing with faster than light communication.
Because of the conditions it took to even get there.
Exactly, right. So
Yeah.
once you're up in that zone, you're in that zone, and your technology limits expand dramatically because the laws of physics are functionally different. The
Ah,
speed of light is no longer a constant in that area.
I see. So I see the slow zone, I see
Mhm.
the beyond, and I see the unthinkable depths.
The unthinking depths.
Oh,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
unthinking. Sorry.
No, no.
I can read.
Oh.
To the maybe I can't read the font. To the Magellanic clouds.
Yeah, so you're kind of looking away at other like little
Okay.
satellite galaxies, like we're looking farther and farther away from our Milky Way. So his
Wow.
example in here is like, if you were looking at this map, you would be kind of looking at a sort of, there it's split in half. There's a two-dimensional layer, like a cross section, and then there's a top-down cross section.
Yeah.
The best way to think about it is the closer you get towards kind of the galactic rim, the actual spiral, the plane rather of the galaxy and the core of the galaxy, that's where you start to hit the slow zone and the unthinking depth. So there's a rough correlative in between star density and the laws of physics. So the
Okay.
farther away you get from star density, the more the laws of physics change,
And
essentially.
as a writer, you have a lot more creative freedom out in those zones outside
So
of the slow
much,
zone.
but also within the limitations of it. So all of these stories you'd think would take place in the the beyond and the whatever else is beyond the beyond, right? But they don't. They almost always take place within the ever fluid area between the slow zone and the beyond. So that area moves in his stories, kind of like a tide on an ocean, is always kind of going in
Interesting.
and out. Yeah. So it's actually the limitations, those barriers of limitations caused by the world that he's constructed here, that create all of the tension for his tales, which is my ultimate point regarding science fiction maps. People ignore the space because they think, gosh, it's not there's no tension here. I'm dealing with a bunch of emptiness. I just want to skip to the end. We have this showing up so often, much to my annoyance, with J.J. Abrams' work across the board. So he took Straczynski's At the Speed of Plotline, and he just magnified it times a power of 1 billion. He was like, all right, so I want this thing to happen, so it happens. Cool, we're done. We're there. We see this happen a lot in modern science fiction where they just jump to the end without having any of the middle because they think the middle isn't tense and is boring. And as writers, they're trained to skip immediately to the human emotional fiery tension. In this story and others like it, we're actually dealing with the tension of time and space itself. We see this a lot in Ursula K. Le Guin's work as well, in her Hainish cycle, where we're dealing with not geography, we're dealing with time, which is kind of, in my opinion, for storytellers, the most important function of geography beyond naming for cultural purposes. So in Lord of the Rings, knowing how long it takes to get to one place to another, it doesn't just say, cool, here are locations that they experience along the way. It says, here is the actual process of the journey that they take. Here is why that matters. Here is how things develop because of that time. And when you stretch it out over light years, you're just stretching that out even more. In the beginning of one of, I know I'm talking a lot here.
No, you're fine.
I get very excited about the subject. But in the beginning of one of Ursula K. Le Guin's short stories, we have a character who gets transported to another part of the galaxy from her world, and her world's been cut off from the rest of the galaxy for a very long time. So she's a primitive person, believes in magic, right? You know, that's the kind of the thing we're working off of. What's so heart-wrenching about that tale is she goes away and she comes back and 2 generations have passed.
Oh yeah.
So we're dealing with the fairy tale experience, but through the lens of science fiction, and that is so poignant and so touching and raises the hairs on the back of my neck every time that I read it. So there's my fundamental thesis argument, is tension can actually come from the landscape itself, even if the landscape, and maybe even especially if the landscape is light years across.
What did you think of not Inception, Interstellar? What did you think of Interstellar?
That was a great one. I know
Their
a lot
use
of
of
people had
time.
yeah, a lot of people had like qualms about that movie, but I got a huge kick out of it. I think that they did a great job with that. They they're playing with a trope that's really heavily used in that type of intellectual science fiction, and I think they did a great job of not going overboard, if that makes any sense. By the time you get to the end there, you really, I found it to be, if not a complete reveal, a delightful way of explaining the sort of moral point of the story.
Yeah.
And they used time and space to do that. I mean, they used time and space to create a space-time parable. That is
Yes.
just lovely.
Because it becomes about like the time you lose to be truly, to go out there and save the world, right? You lose your own time. You lose the time that you could have been with your daughter who's growing up. And then you lose time when you're on that mountain, right? Or not that mountain, that planet with all the wave mountains.
Yeah.
Every second's like a year on Earth. I don't remember, but like when you start to realize how time is so fleeting and how that is really like, it's an enemy. It's something to be feared, as a point of tension when you're space traveling. I mean, I walked away from it feeling very appreciative of the time and the seconds that I get to experience right now.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they did a beautiful job with that film. Kudos, guys, if you're listening.
So my last map does not require a full depth breakdown. It was more of my version of like, my Game of Thrones map was like a nice analysis comparing it to real world, because it was attempting to recreate real world locations. So being able to kind of draw that. This map is more about your actual experience as a gamer. So I'm talking about the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild map of Hyrule.
Oh, this is great.
Have you played the game?
I have. It's been a while, but I definitely have.
Okay, so of course the reason why I love this map is because you're a player in the world and you get to make use of natural resources. This is not unique to this game, obviously, but I would say it's the first time that you get to experience it on this scale for a Zelda game. Different foods and items can be collected in different parts of the map, which makes you appreciate the biodiversity. And for children playing the game, it's a nice introduction to food sources as well as cultural diversity. So as a character, you have to accomplish certain tasks throughout the map, and your adversaries reflect the attributes of those areas. So ice creatures and ice mountains, that kind of stuff. So in Game of Thrones, we had King's Landing as a harbor town, harbor city, along the edge of the country because, it benefits from the trade routes and the natural development that could have happened, like New York City, for example. Here you have Hyrule Castle dead center in the map
Mhm.
where a lot of rivers have come together and it creates a moat around it. And so surrounded by it, you have your regions, and they're mostly identified by their climates. So the Northwest is, I'm going to butcher these names, Hebra, which is an icy region. Northeast is Akala, where you have forests and lakes and grassy plains and all that stuff. Southwest
Mhm.
is Gerudo Valley, which is made me think of Dorne in Westeros. And then
Uh-huh.
along the southeast stretch, you have Faron, Lanairu, and Nakluda, which are like lush riverlands. So I had an overarching question for this map, which was, where is the separation between realism and fantasy when it comes to maps? Where do you have to let go of reality to tell a good
Hmm.
story?
Ooh, I love that question. Right. Well, here we have a mythology, a mythos that's pretty well developed within all of those different Zelda games. There's a lot of stuff going on there. You can actually see a lot of the depth that's been created. It's interesting for one thing because it's a completely bordered map. So it is there's maybe some hint that there's something else in the world, but not much. It's mostly this is the world. We're going to pay attention just to this. Will there be anything else? You'll have to wait for a future game.
Yeah.
We actually kind of see that within the Elder Scrolls games as well, especially the early ones where they're like, here is the world, and yeah, it's connected to the rest of the world, but you don't really get to see it or pay attention to it. Um, but we also have this heavy concentration of kind of mythic features within a single map. So we've got the world of the known in the center, surrounded by all of those little lakes and rivers, and it's clearly the place to be. It's the nice zone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you have mythic desert land, mythic
Mm-hmm.
forest land, mythic ocean land. We've got these very big archetypes that are being played out on the map. I think that's fine, honestly. I mean, the ultimate thing is there are no rules with writing for anybody listening to this who's going, "Oh God, my fantasy map that I'm trying to write, fantasy story I'm trying to write doesn't have a good map. I'm a failure." No, just write the dang thing, have fun.
Mm-hmm.
I think where it can become really useful, let's go in that direction. Where it become really useful is if you want to highlight specific types of mythic archetypal tension within your story. So if you really want to highlight different struggles in nature, different alchemical forces within nature, you can have the avatar, the land of fire and the land of earth. You can separate things up in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And here we see that very clearly. I mean, what's the big terrifying place? Death Mountain.
Yes.
So we clearly have a lot to consider with the fact that directly next to the Great Hyrule Forest, you've got Death Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting here is there's also like roads spread throughout everywhere, including all the way up to Death Mountain. So Death Mountain can't be that terrifying a place if there's a tourist destination
Yes.
directly, to it. I think that that's one of the things that we can start to explore from this map. This is a map that, for me, looking at it, has an instant sense of play, which makes sense. It's a game map. It has a sense of fun, and it's also compressed down by the needs of the game itself in order to create all of the different environments that it wanted to. So, what are you trying to do in your story is ultimately going to come down to how good of a writer are you? How much have you practiced? How much have you read? What are you trying to do as a storyteller? And this kind of map is going to lead you to creating a very different type of story if you started with it than if you didn't. And it's going to be a product of a very particular type of story if you didn't start with a map and just wrote this story and then created the map afterwards. So
Mm.
kind of a long form explanation, but
No, I think that's great. How can we learn from real world maps when creating our fictional maps?
it depends upon what your goal is, I think.
Okay.
So you had this great, I loved your water flows explanation.
Drinking while you're drinking
Take some
water.
I clearly like to talk. So um, yeah, I loved your water flows explanation of, looking at a real world map because it's just one thing. It's just one element of real world mapping, but has such a huge effect. Everything that we do stems from that understanding those water flows, right? I think that we have to peel back the layers as we're creating a map for a story, especially if we're going to start with it. We have to understand that we're not going to be able to create the same depth, and that's okay. Maps are a representation. They're a symbolic representation of ideas, and we take it from there. So we've talked about names. We've talked about some ways to create some of that depth. And we've also talked really briefly about how we could, create depth from perspective. So the Hobbit's map of the Shire is going to be very different than the map of the Shire from the people in Rohan, who don't even know that hobbits exist, right? So there's going to be a difference of perspective.
Imagine if Sauron wrote a map. It's like his center and then underlings.
Yeah, mine. Yeah, I think as writers, when we're going into this, let's assume that we wanted to start with a rough map. First off, we need to understand that the map is going to need to change a bit based upon where we take the story. And then we're going to need to, as we continue to develop the story and the map together, one, keep the map fixed, because we're going to want to really create the sense of solidity and depth of space and time. So once you've really decided that it takes 2 weeks to get from, point A to point B, you better make sure that it takes 2 weeks,
Yes.
Figure out why and how. And then allow there to be those blank spaces that we don't necessarily see as much on a modern map. Allow there to be those spaces that aren't as well defined, and just make absolutely sure that you, as the writer, and the characters who are inhabiting the world are aware that this is a perspective, not an absolute, because that's where we start to fall into the realm of the colonizer mindset of this is the way things are, and it's clearly not. So with all of that, I think you can go forwards and create some really exciting maps to go alongside your stories.
And where can I go for like resources in actually drawing and creating a map?
That's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of them out there. Honestly, if you just search, if you Google search map making software, you will find 15 different types of software that are currently doing it. I haven't found any really good open source software, free and open source software, which is usually what I try to recommend to people. So there are paid options out there, which you can find them yourselves. But in terms of open source, free and open source, if anyone is listening to this right now, writers need a free and open source alternative that allows you to do this kind of work. So
Yep. All right. Well, that concludes my questions. So any final thoughts, remarks, or promotions?
Well, I would love to take a brief moment to promote my own podcast and my own writing group, which you are actually going to be a guest on before too long here.
Woo.
So Roundtable Writers is my organization, and I'm sure you'll find the link in the show notes. It's a group dedicated to supporting other writers. So our whole point is to support other writers and make other writers feel supported, to bring out the best that our community as a broad global community can possibly have. And other than that, I'd like to just really quickly direct people to two neat organizations. Every Library. Go ahead and support Every Library, because libraries are really important. And Socrates Cafe, Democracy Cafe, because communicating with other people and learning how to communicate effectively is also really important.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.